So tonight we start with class number 1 on Jung's answer to Job. And this will be an introductory session in which I'll just make some introductory remarks in order to set the stage for our leisurely and detailed study of this magnificent and profound work of Jung's. I think to put it most generally, we can say that Answer to Job is a examination of the Judeo-Christian myth, a depth psychological examination of the Judeo-Christian myth. And it's this myth that is at the core of the Western psyche. And therefore, it's at the core of the psyche of all of us, with the possible exception of Sachiko Reese, who, if she's been here a while, may have sunk in for her too. Another way of putting it is that Answer to Job is a continuation of Ion, which we worked on last year. And Jung says as much in this prefatory note. Where he says, the most immediate cause of my writing the book is perhaps to be found in certain problems discussed in my book Ion, especially the problems of Christ as a symbolic figure and of the antagonism Antichrist represented in the traditional zodiacal symbolism of the two fishes. You'll remember from our Ion course that the basic issue in Ion was the double or bipolar nature of the Christian God image that unfolded itself in the course of the history of the Christian eon. So that starting out with the image of the good Son of Yahweh, Christ, in the first half of the eon, a gradual enantiodromia took place, and the opposite, the Antichrist pole of the bipolar deity, began to manifest in the second half of the Christian eon. Answer to Job continues the study of the Western God image, and in particular explores how human consciousness changes the nature of that God image. Now, in order to avoid confusion as you're reading Answer to Job, I think it's important to distinguish three different aspects or three different versions of the Western God image. Let me just list the three. Number one is the God image as pictured in the Old Testament, the Yahweh God image. Number two is the God image as pictured in Christian theology. This corresponds to the image that Christ delineated, represented by the God of love. And number three is the God image as experienced psychologically by modern man. The Old Testament God, the New Testament God, and God as experienced psychologically. Let me say a few words about each of those in turn. Jung talks about all three of these intermittently and interweaves the three. He never spells out quite explicitly the three different ones. They're all implied. That's why I want to make it crystal clear that one is really dealing with three different entities, because otherwise you can get lost and confused as to what Jung is talking about when he's proceeding. Even when he's talking about the Old Testament Yahweh, he's doing so out of his experience of the God image as encountered psychologically. So we really need to keep these three separate. Let me say a few words about each of them. First, the God image as pictured in the Old Testament. This is the God image that was experienced by Job. It's characterized by a combination of opposites. He's both kind and wrathful, both just and unjust, and he contains these opposites without contradiction, because no consciousness has ever intervened to challenge the contradiction. And Job, in his encounter with Yahweh, becomes that consciousness, you see, that perceives contradiction and therefore generates a challenge to Yahweh. That's the Yahweh Old Testament God image. And then number two, we have the God image as pictured in Christian theology. In Christian theology, the God image of Yahweh has undergone a transformation by the incarnation. It's never said so outright. It would be kind of scandalous to say it outright. But in the legendary and marginal material, it's stated quite explicitly that Yahweh was tamed in the lap of the Virgin. He underwent a transformation. That's the idea. By being incarnated as man. The Yahweh God image is born as a man, and in the process of that incarnation, he takes on a one-sided goodness. He becomes exclusively the loving, benevolent God. It has no darkness in him, and that's represented by the figure of Christ, who is theologically considered to be the Son of God. But as Jung points out, he's only one of two sons. In the background is the other son, Satan, the Antichrist, who's going to have his day sooner or later. So that's the God image as pictured in Christian theology. Now we come up to number three, the God image as experienced psychologically by modern man. And that takes us up to right now and to our own individual experience that we need to bring to this study of the answer to Job in order to make it really relevant psychologically. Now, Jung has had a lot to say about how the God image is experienced psychologically. I want to give you a little taste of some of those remarks he's had to say. In the vision seminars, I think probably around 1933, something like that. That's about the date. He has this to say about the nature of the God image as experienced psychologically. And this comes from volume 2, page 391 of the spring version, spring publications version of the Vision Seminar. He says, for the collective unconscious, we could use the word God. And I skip a little. You all know what the unconscious is. You have certain dreams that carry the hallmark of the collective unconscious. Instead of dreaming of aunt this or that, or uncle that, you dream of a lion. And then the analyst will tell you that is a mythological motive. And you will understand that it's collective unconscious. So you get the collective unconscious right there. This God is no longer miles of abstract space away from you in an extra mundane sphere. This divinity is not a concept in a theological textbook or in the Bible. It's an immediate thing. It happens in your dreams at night. It causes you to have pains in the stomach, diarrhea, constipation, a whole host of neuroses. If you try to formulate it, think what the collective unconscious is, after all, you wind up by concluding that it is what the prophets were concerned with. It sounds exactly like some things in the Old Testament, where God sends plagues upon people. He burns their bones in the night. He injures their kidneys. He causes all sorts of trouble. Then you come naturally to the dilemma. Is that really God? Is God a neurosis? Now that is a shocking dilemma, I admit. But when you think consistently and logically, you come to the conclusion that God is a most shocking problem. And that is the truth. God has shocked people out of their wits. Think what he did to poor old Hosea. He was a respectable man, and he had to marry a prostitute. Probably he suffered from a strange kind of mother complex. Okay, there's one passage that will give you an idea of what the God image is when you encounter it psychologically. And, I'm going to go on more. In the Terry Lectures, Psychology and Religion, Jung discusses a patient who had a cancer phobia. He was convinced that he had cancer. And no amount of medical examinations that proved him healthy would convince him that he didn't have cancer. Jung says about this case, What shall we now reply to our patient with the imaginary cancer? I would tell him, yes, my friend, you are really suffering from a cancer-like thing. You really harbor a deadly evil, which, however, will not kill your body because it is imaginary, but it will eventually kill your soul. It has already spoiled and even poisoned your human relations, your personal happiness, and it will go on thus, ever increasing, until it has swallowed your whole psychic existence. So it will be an evil, destructive tumor. He goes on, and we'll skip a bit. He says it's, to my mind, a fatal mistake to consider the human psyche as a merely personal affair. If some slight trouble occurs, perhaps in the form of an unseen, unforeseen, and somewhat extraordinary event, instantly instinctive forces are called up, which appear to be wholly unexpected, new, and strange. They can no longer be explained by personal motives. They are comparable rather to certain primitive occurrences like panics and solar eclipses and such things. The change of character that is brought up by the uprush of collective forces is amazing. A gentle and reasonable being can be transformed into a maniac or a savage beast. As a matter of fact, we are always living upon a volcano. And there is, as far as we know, no human means of protection against a possible outburst which will destroy everybody within its reach. It needs as little as a neurosis to conjure up a force that cannot be dealt with by reasonable means. Our cancer case shows clearly how impotent human reason and intellect are against the most powerful nonsense. I always advise my patients to take such obvious but invincible nonsense as the manifestation of a power and a meaning not yet understood. Our case is confronted with a willpower and a suggestion more than equal to anything his consciousness can put against it. In this precarious situation, it would be bad strategy to convince the patient that he is somehow, though in a highly incomprehensible way, at the back of his own symptom, secretly inventing and supporting it. Such a suggestion would instantly paralyze his fighting spirit. He would get demoralized. It is much better if he understands that his complex is an autonomous power, i.e., God. I'm adding the i.e., but that's his meaning. So that this case, who was caught by his cancer phobia, that's how the God image manifested in him. In an interview that he gave not long before his death, Jung made this remark. He says, "To this day, God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path, violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life, for better or worse." In a letter, he refers to his experience of God. This is from Volume 2, page 32 of the letters. Just read you a few passages. He's answering a letter from Erich Neumann, who had responded to his manuscript of Answer to Job. He says, "I can no longer consider the average reader. Rather, he has to consider me. That's why we it's so hard for us to understand the answer to Job. This is the attitude he's laying it out of. I can no longer consider the average reader, us, average readers. Rather, he has to consider me. I have to pay this tribute to the pitiless fact of my old age. With the undimmed prospect of all-around incomprehension, I could exercise no suasions. There was no hope of funneling knowledge into fools. Not in my livery, but naked and bare, I must go down to the grave, fully aware of the outrage my nakedness will provide. But what is that compared with the arrogance I have to summon up in order to be able to insult God? The book is about the canonical God image. This is our prime concern, not a general philosophical concept. God is always specific and always locally valid. The Western God image is the valid one for me, whether I assent to it intellectually or not. I do not go in for religious philosophy, but am held in thrall, almost crushed, and defend myself as best I can. I'm confined to my living thraldom. This is local, barbaric, infantile, and abysmally unscientific. So that's the quality of the God image and the God experience that Jung had, that he wrote the answer to Job out of. Then again, in another letter, a few days earlier, he's replying to a letter about answer to Job, in which the respondent made some comment about his sarcasm. Well, friends, you bothered me too. I would have liked to avoid sarcasm and mockery, but couldn't, for that is the way I felt. And if I had not said so, it would have made it all the worse, but hidden. I realized only afterwards that they have their place as expressing resistance to God's nature, which sets us at odds with ourselves. I had to wrench myself free of God, so to speak, in order to find that unity in myself which God seeks through man. Sarcasm is certainly not a pretty quality, but I am forced to use even means I find reprehensible in order to deliver myself from the Father. God himself uses very different means to jolt these human beings into consciousness. It has not yet been forgotten, I hope, what happened in Germany and what is happening day after day in Russia. Job's sufferings never cease and multiply a millionfold. By remaining with the Father, I deny him the human being in whom he could unify himself and become one. And how can I help him better than by becoming one myself? Sarcasm is the means by which we hide our hurt feelings from ourselves, and from this you can see how very much the knowledge of God has wounded me, and how very much I would have preferred to remain a child in the Father's protection and shun the problem of opposites. It's probably even more difficult to deliver oneself from good than from evil. But without sin, there's no breaking away from the good Father. Sarcasm plays the corresponding role in this case. And one more. Page 434. I'm discussing the admittedly anthropomorphic image of Yahweh and I do not apply metaphysical judgments. From this methodological standpoint, I gain the necessary freedom of criticism. The absence of human morality in Yahweh is a stumbling block which cannot be overlooked. As little as the fact that nature, that is God's creation, does not give us enough reason to believe it to be purposeful or reasonable in the human sense. We miss reason and moral values. It's therefore obvious that the Yahwistic image or conception of the deity is less than that of certain human specimens. The image of a personified brutal force and of an unethical and non-spiritual mind, yet inconsistent enough to exhibit traits of kindness and generosity besides a violent power drive. Picture of a sort of nature demon, and a primitive chieftain aggrandized to a colossal size. This image allows itself to owes its existence to certain experiences the prophets had. And he then goes on, this shocking defectuosity of the God image ought to be explained or understood. The nearest analogy to it is our experience of the unconscious. It is a psyche whose nature can only be described by paradoxes. It is personal as well as impersonal, moral and amoral, just and unjust, ethical and unethical, of cunning intelligence, and at the same time blind, immensely strong, and extremely weak. This is the psychic foundation which produces the raw material for our conceptual structures. The unconscious is a piece of nature our mind cannot comprehend, can only sketch models. It's interesting as one reads the letters. Jung gives us a picture of how he came to write Answer to Job. It wasn't a rational decision, as you might expect. It took place in the spring of 1951. He was 75 years old, going on 76. He was in the midst of a febrile illness. It was virtually dictated to him from the unconscious. And as soon as it was completed, his illness was over. In a letter in July of 1951, he writes, "If there is anything like the spirit seizing one by the scruff of the neck, it was the way this book came into being." And then a couple of years later, he described it this way. He says, "The book came to me during the fever of an illness. It was as if accompanied by the great music of a Bach or a Handel. I just had the feeling of listening to a great composition, or rather of being at a concert. The experience of the book was for me a drama that was not mine to control. I felt myself utterly the causa ministerialis of my book. It came upon me suddenly and unexpectedly during a feverish illness. I feel its content as the unfolding of the divine consciousness in which I participate, like it or not." Another anecdote that I understand he told to Esther Harding, who related to me, is that during his illness, a figure sat on his bedpost and dictated Answer to Job to him. he says something about this in another letter, too. On page 155 of the second volume of the letters. He's responding to a review of the book Answer to Job. I'm profoundly grateful to you for your most remarkably objective review of my uncouth attempt to disturb the obnoxious somnolence of the guardians. That is the way in which this damnable little book looks to me. I would not have written this thing. I had kept away from it studiously. I had published before the volume Ion in polite language and as much man-made as possible. It was not sufficient, apparently, because I got ill. And when I was in the fever, it caught me and brought me down to writing. Despite my fever, my age, and my heart was none too good. I can assure you I am a moral coward as long as possible. As a good little bourgeois citizen, I am lying low and concealed as deep as possible. Still shocked by the amount of the indiscretions I have committed. Swearing to myself that there will be no more of it because I want peace and a friendly neighborhood, and a good conscience and the sleep of the just. Why should I be the unspeakable fool to jump into the cauldron? Well, I don't want to be melodramatic. This is just for your personal information. I have no merit, no proper guilt, since I got it like a dog to a kick, as we say. And the little moral coward that I am goes on whining, why should I be always the one that collects all the available kicks? I tell you these things because you've been nice and just and lenient with me. The attribute coarse is mild in comparison to what you feel when God dislocates your hip or when he slays the firstborn. That's one side of my experiences with what is called God. Coarse is too weak a word for it. Crude, violent, cruel, bloody, hellish, demonic would be better. That I was not downright blasphemous, I owe to my domestication and polite cowardice. And, as always, the opposite. And at each step, I felt hindered by a beatific vision, of which I better say nothing. But he did say something in Memory Stream's reflections about that. What page? That's page 155 of the second volume of the letters. And it's real. After all his complaints, he says, that is one side of my experience with what is called God. Coarse is too weak a word for it. Crude, violent, cruel, bloody, hellish, demonic would be better. That I was not downright blasphemous, I owe to my domestication and polite cowardice. And at each step, I felt hindered by a beatific vision, of which I better say nothing. In other words, he's also experienced the opposite. That's the point. I think another description of Jung and his state while he's writing Answer to Job is found in the way he describes John, the author of the book of Revelation, on page 82 of Answer to Job. Here's the way he describes St. John the Divine, the author of the book of Revelation. He says, in confinio mortis, at the edge of death, and in the evening of a long and eventful life, a man will often see immense vistas of time stretching out before him. Such a man no longer lives in the everyday world and in the vicissitudes of personal relationships, but in the sight of many eons and in the movement of ideas as they pass from century to century. That description applies to Jung, I think. And it's out of that state of mind that the answer to Job was written. Whenever I start to consider a work, first thing I look at is the title. I assume that the titles will have depths of meaning that bear a little reflection. They're not just casual labels. This book is titled Answer to Job. Now, Jung tells us in the course of the work what the first level of meaning of that title is. Since Yahweh treated Job unjustly, and since that fact was consciously registered by Job, crime that Yahweh committed against Job due to his unconsciousness required an answer. And Jung tells us in the book that Yahweh's answer to his unjust treatment of Job was his incarnation as man. But since Job as an image of humanity, at the encounter had more consciousness than Yahweh, Yahweh had to catch up with him, so to speak, and the answer was for Yahweh to become man. That's the obvious first level meaning of the title, Answer to Job. But I believe there's a second level meaning too. And I suspect that Jung was perfectly aware of the second level meaning. Likewise, second level meaning is that Jung is providing the answer to Job. Because even though the first level meaning took place 2,000 years ago, nobody has realized up to now that was an answer to Job. And if something doesn't reach consciousness, it doesn't exist. So Jung's insight about this state of affairs effectively answers Job, and of course not only the Job of antiquity, but Job as the archetype of all of suffering humanity, that has been obliged to suffer unjustly because of the nature of reality. Because, as Jung tells us in here, God is reality itself. Finally, just one further remark concerning the magnitude of this work. Von Trance, in her biography of Jung, tells us that this is the one work with which Jung was completely satisfied. He would have liked to have had the opportunity to rewrite all of his other works, but this one, he wouldn't change a word. We're not going to appreciate adequately its full meaning in our brief study. In my opinion, it will take centuries for the meaning of this work to be assimilated. But I think a good attitude with which to approach it is one in which you recognize its magnitude, and when you run across something that you don't understand, don't assume that Jung's making a mistake because you don't understand it. Okay.